Hi, I'm Lizzy Welch, and this is my book report presentation. I'm doing mine over As Nature Made Him, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Girl by John Colapinto. John Colapinto was a journalist in the early 90s, or the 90s and early 2000s, and he wrote articles for journals or magazines, I guess, like Rolling Stones, which is actually how he met the person this book is based on, David Reimer. Um, and the intended audience is kind of just mostly people in not sex ed classes, human sexuality classes like this, or anyone interested in the topic of intersex or sex reassignment. And just a brief summary: intersex, people who are born with abnormal genitalia, so not exactly female, not exactly male. And at the time, it also meant men with micro penises. In or at least when the book is based in like the 60s and 70s, it did. So, also, I'd like to just take 1 minute and sort of say, uh, I'm going to use the names and genders they used in the book like throughout the person's life because otherwise it gets really, really confusing. Um, Personally, so I just say that because misgendering, which I guess you would consider it if I called David, who the person who now goes by David, if I called him Brenda now, would be considered misgendering. But it's how it's done in the book, so I'm going to consider that's okay with David, and sort of consider it not misgendering because that's kind of a big deal in the transgender and intersex communities, I know. And even though David's not technically intersex, he kind of lived the life of a intersex child. Okay, so basically, long story short, two twin boys were born in Winnipeg, Canada, in like the late 60s, and during circumcision, one of them was accidentally castrated. Don't know how you accidentally castrate someone, but it was a really gross description in the book. Um, and then the parents, desperate to find a solution to help their child live a normal life and have a family and kids, went to a doctor in Baltimore called John Money. He worked at Johns Hopkins and was kind of famous for his work in sex reassignment and intersex, and was really pushy about it, and convinced these parents to sex reassign their child Bruce. Bruce and Brian were the twins. Bruce is the one who lost his penis. Sex reassigned Bruce to a little girl at just before the age of 2 named Brenda. And it was basically kind of to help his own argument of nature versus nurture. He believed that raising a child as a girl, regardless of their original biology, they would consider themselves a woman. And even he determined that they would be a heterosexual woman as well. So completely disregarding like sex and gender and all that and sexuality. But John Money is kind of like a diva. He's kind of like Satan. Sorry, I think I'm funny. I don't know if it actually shows up, but there was fire on my head. I've never actually used the video form of this. I've only ever taken selfies. But basically, the doctor convinced them to change the gender of their child to Brenda and she went through all these issues, like she had never really had friends, she was always really tomboyish, and her parents just sort of like clung to the idea that this would work, which it really didn't. And until about the age of 14, she adamantly refused to like receive a full like they gave her a rudimentary vagina when she was a baby, and like they wanted to give her a full like woman's vagina around puberty time, and she just kept refusing. And Brenda hated the idea of growing boobs, so like she was on estrogen pills, so she did eventually, and like kind of combated every step that they took. She never really had friends. She had problems in schools. She changed schools every year. Um, and she went to a psychiatrist, and it wasn't until she tried, I think she was 14, when eventually her dad picked her up one day and kind of just told her, like, you were born a boy, We and gave her the whole story basically, and gave the same story to her brother who was also in the dark about it. The whole family had known, so all the parents and stuff. And at this point, she decides she's like, okay, I want to be a boy again, and renames herself to David, and he continues to live as David for the rest of his life. Um, and basically from there on, a lot of the book is about uh, the science and the scientists and kind of the arguments behind nature versus nurture and who argued what and what do befits John Money through, which was a lot. He refused to work with anyone. If anyone challenged him, he tried to excommunicate them, which, by the way, he was challenged by a grad student, a PhD student at KU, Rack Jack. And, that was in like the 50s or 60s, and so he threw a fit. Right before the Reimer case came to him. And was basically, he lied about it. He claimed that the case was successful through all of Brenda's childhood, that she was successfully living as a woman, until, she did transition back to David as a man. And whenever someone questioned him, he'd be like, "Oh, I lost track of them." BBC had done a documentary on it, and he said that was the reason, like they were traumatized by this, and he was just full of bullshit. Honestly, like, if I ever meet John Money, I'd probably beat the crap out of him for what he did to, like, David and every other person, because it wasn't for, I'm sorry, I'm ranting, but it wasn't for the good of the patient, but for his own gain. Next is, sorry, I'm trying to, the critical analysis. I do think it's really consistent with what we learned about sexuality. There are some things that I disagree with, such as, like, even just using nature versus nurture for something like gender, I disagree with, because of the whole, transgender people are born with, like, a transgender man is born with male or female genitalia, but is actually, genders himself as a woman and therefore is a woman. So it's not really their biology, and I mean, they're usually raised as their birth sex, so obviously it's not nurture in that case as well. But other than that, like, I think it's really consistent, like, it's, John Colapinto does a really good job of not putting his biases in the book in general. Like, obviously you can tell, like, I don't think that, like, you can tell he's like, I don't think John Money's right on this, because, he kind of brings out every negative aspect of the man, not that I really saw many good aspects. Rather than, and I mean scientific evidence, he really does focus, like, I think an entire third of the book is about research and, like, movements in the past of intersex children and, like, basically the evolution of sex reassignment surgery and, like, articles that have been written, or at least about the doctors who wrote them and how they, like, everyone has a history in it too. So, like, I fell asleep reading one chapter and woke up and I was like, oh my god, who's Jane and Robert? And Jane ended up being David's wife. And he did get married and have a child after, living his life as a woman, or man, I'm sorry, living his adulthood as a man. He did eventually find a woman to marry who actually had 3 children already, so he adopted them. I don't think their background, or John's background, really is intersex or not sex education, I keep trying to say that, human sexuality or sex reassignment, but he did confer with a lot of psychiatrists and doctors and urologists, and he got as much like scientific evidence as he could. I think the bias in this is definitely towards nature rather than nurture. Obviously, in the end, he does specifically state, like, it is nature that dictates gender. And, biased against John Money, but I think everyone who's ever met John Money would say they're also biased against him, so I can't really. I haven't even met the man, and I hate him. He's like 90 now, too, so sometimes I feel bad hating him, but then I'd read a new section about him, and I'd be like, okay, no, I still hate you. Um, the overall quality, I'd probably be a little hesitant to recommend this to some people. Like a lot of the people I know, I grew up in a really small conservative town from Kansas. So a lot of the people I know are from that town, and I'd probably only recommend it to people that I knew it wouldn't offend or bother, something like that, because, transgender, intersex, and sex reassignment is kind of a topic. I guess everything is a topic, but it's a little bit of a sensitive topic, or I would assume so in my hometown. I'd recommend this definitely to psychology students. I'm sorry, I can't speak sometimes. Um, Mostly because, or anyone who like showed some interest in, human sexuality and general topics of like transgender, intersex, gender identity specifically. Um, I think the big strength is all of like the obvious work that's gone into it. For one, John Colapinto, he did his research. He did interviews with probably a dozen different people, um, because David Reimer, when he was still Brenda, had 4 or 5 different psychiatrists and worked with like like at least 2 urologists plus John Money, who never commented, but and then also John Colapinto also worked with people who were opposed to Dr. Money, who had actually never met David, but just knew about the topic or had written. There's one article that they kind of wrote as like the final follow up on the twin. It was called the twins study or the twins case or something at the time, with Money, and he published a lot of shit about it, and he ended up like saying he lost contact, but in the end, this doctor called Sigmundson, who was and Diamond, who were kind of like the 2 arch nemesis of Money, which means I probably would like them. They found David and were like, would you mind if we wrote one more article about you, and sort of, told them like this isn't working. Money was wrong. They're still doing this to children, and it's sort of based off of your study. And so they did, and they, everything was confidential still. They used the names John and Joan rather than Brenda, Bruce, and David. I think the big weakness in this. Sorry, that was a really long strength section and went really off topic. I think the weakness is, the biggest one is that it depends entirely on nature versus nurture, which I don't agree with the topic of gender. Um, while I do think biology probably plays, a little bit of a role, obviously, but I don't think it plays the entire role. Obviously, or else they would have found the basis of what determines your gender rather than just determining your sex with your genitalia. That's probably the biggest weakness I could find. It was one thing that I really disagreed with throughout the entire book. But other than that, like, it was a really good book. I really enjoyed reading it, and I don't know how to end something like this. I apologize for my rants and my, like, going off topic, and this is 4 minutes longer than it should have been. I'm gonna just press stop. Have a nice